And that's really what this has all been about. And I call this the passive pathway, that we want to enable the neurophysiology of the client, of the child, of the spouse, of the pet to be welcoming to our engagement. And that's very polyvagal because what do we mean by engagement? We mean looking at the person, smiling and gesturing and using intonation in our voice. So Safe and Sound Protocol is all about the social engagement system and signaling, and that's the magic take-home word, signaling the other's nervous system that it's safe enough to be accessible.
Hello, EMDR learning community. Welcome. Our talk about EMDR, the Polyvagal Theory and the Safe and Sound Protocol. We are here with a panel, Dr. Stephen Porges, Karen Onderko, and with Jill Hosey. So welcome, everyone. We are talking today about EMDR and the Safe and Sound Protocol. There's a new book by Karen and Steve called Safe and Sound, a polyvagal approach for connection, change, and healing. So welcome, Steve, welcome, Karen, and welcome, Jill.
Thank you.
I want to start with the beginning. And Steve, I'm wondering, I know that most of people who watch this webinar know about the polyvagal theory, but I'm wondering if you can take us back to the early research and how you started this research and how you found the polyvagal theory.
It was a journey that was basically trying to solve a paradox. And the paradox was really observed in the intensive care unit, newborn intensive care unit, because healthy babies had a lot of rhythmic heart rate variability, and that was vagal, that was vaguely mediated. But the babies that were really at great risk and basically risk for demise, death, were having bradycardias, where the heart rate gets slow. But that was also a vagal phenomenon. So now you're confronted with two response patterns that are both assumed to be vagal. One is protective and one is potentially lethal. Solve that problem.
Mm-hmm.
And the issue was that brought me on this journey. I've been doing research in obstetrics and neonatology for, let's say, 15 years or so, and I was with the goal of trying to develop methodologies that would be helpful for medical care to anticipate basically serious conditions. And this led me into a journey of trying to understand the neurophysiology of the signals. And the answer really was so simple. It was the reason the babies were dying, and they were primarily preterm babies, was that the vagus, they didn't understand what the vagus was, basically. I wouldn't say the babies, but the vagus was a conduit, it was a pipe, and it had different wires in it. That's how we have to think about it. And it had two different wires coming from different areas of the brainstem that were coming through the vagus. So the vagus was not a unitary nerve, it was a polynerve. And the issue was it's not only a polynerve in terms of its motor actions on the heart, one creating respiratory sinus arrhythmia and the other one causing bradycardia. It was primarily a sensory nerve evaluating the status of the body. So these babies who were under high risk, the sensory information was saying, listen, reduce all your metabolic output, shut down. And so the heart rates would slow with bradycardia. And and if the baby's born prematurely, this is where the secrets start to unfold. The actual mammalian, this newer ventral vagus with the respiratory component, didn't come in developmentally until, let's say, latter parts of the last trimester. So the baby came into the world not prepared to be an air-breathing organism. So the issue was the physiology was really there. We just had to understand it. Now flip it forward in terms of what does that tell us? It tells us that there's a developmental and literally evolutionary change which is mapped into our development. And if we don't reach a certain maturational level, our bodies will respond in a way that's adaptive for reptiles or very primitive vertebrae, but could be lethal to us. But that rule of phylogenetic or evolutionary stages is mapped out in our own development, but also in our reaction to threat. And this is where polyvagal theory became really at home with the world of trauma, because people who had survived trauma actually lived through these sequences of what the polyvagal theory described. So when you're healthy and safe, you have a social engagement, your face works, your voice works, because it's all linked to the calming of your vagus. And the interesting part is this mammalian vagus allows our voice to literally project our physiological state. And when our voice is shrill and when people have anxious voice, they have a vagal withdrawal. And we know that. We see them as anxious and defensive. So the first one is this ventral vagus. This is what we want to be in. It's mammalian. But when we don't have the resources, we move into a more fight or flight, a sympathetic one. And everyone knows that. You get triggered, whoosh, you're fight there. But what I would say, the community didn't understand was that if you don't have the metabolic resources to fight or flee, you may shut down. So you have a reaction of life threat, and that recruits this very primitive vagal circuit, which works well in reptiles, works well in amphibia. In a sense, it basically reduces metabolic output, motor activity, to conserve resources. But what does it do to humans? We can't survive. So we
Mm.
start seeing the translation of what I saw in the NICU, in the neonatal intensive care unit, into a response strategy of survival. And then we go one step further. We start seeing intervention strategies and strategies of socialization, of signaling safety to move that nervous system back up into its safe state, because in that safe state, it supports homeostatic functions. And the final point is that we use words like stress, words like anxiety, and we probably, if we want to understand what's going on, throw those words away. We want to know, is our autonomic nervous system supporting homeostatic functions of health, growth, and restoration, and even sociality, or not? When it's not, we are under physiological stress. When
Mhm.
it is, we're resilient, we're resource, we're fun, we're playful, and we explore. So
Yeah.
exploration is challenge, but we love challenges when we're resourced.
Yeah.
That's
So
it.
just to give us a little bit of kind of orientation, how long, because the polyvagal theory, now everybody talks about the polyvagal theory in 2025, but how long have you been doing the research about polyvagal
Oh,
theory?
well, the research started in the late 1960s. The theory came out in 1994. It was published in 95.
Uh-huh.
Um, but the issue was, I thought, was the culmination of, my decades of work in 1995. And I thought, that's there. Let people have fun with it.
Yeah.
Because what it did is created a plausible understanding of our reactions. And we could toss out words like stress and anxiety, and we start getting more contact with our physiology. And I just been waiting, people, it's been an interesting movement.
Yeah.
And I would say the first traction for the theory did not come in where I thought it would. I thought it would be in the intensive care unit, because I was describing what they were doing. But in a sense, neonatologists are still looking at heart rate patterns like they did in the 60s. There's no change.
Yeah.
They just didn't move from observables to neural indicators. And what polyvagal theory gave people, they gave people a language of neural indicators. And so that's what happened. But really, the traction came in the world of trauma. And why did it happen? And it wasn't necessarily the therapist. It was the therapist who had trauma histories. And because the narrative of the theory described their experience. And suddenly, with an understanding of what their body did, the whole treatment of trauma moved from a chaos, not understanding what's going on, uncertainty, to a personal narrative of survival, and often heroic survival. The
You
nervous
mean for
system
the therapist?
for the therapist and therapists for their clients.
Yeah.
But there's a background that most of us are unaware of, and that is that many of the trauma therapists have a trauma history.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing, and we've done research on this with body psychotherapists, and where the number and percentage of those who have trauma histories is well above the normative level. However, their autonomic reactivity, their ability to regulate their state, is better than normal. So, in a
Hmm.
sense, their election to be a therapist, to be a body therapist, which has movement, connection, observation, was actually a therapeutic journey for them, very successful.
Yes. Okay, so polyvagal theory has been around for a while, and then I think that moves me, Karen, to this book that just came out. So you and Steve co-authored and talk about the safe and sound protocol. So Karen, maybe you can introduce yourself and maybe talk a little bit about the safe and sound protocol, what it is, how it's related to the polyvagal theory, and why should our members know about it? Why should therapists know about the safe and sound protocol?
Great, thank you. So I'm Karen Onderko. I've been working with Steve actually for a decade in helping to bring the SSP into the market. My own first experience with polyvagal theory was through a research lab that I was working in, where we were looking at physiological state and its effects on executive functioning. Anyway, it's been a joy of the past 10 years to collaborate with Steve and with other people to do this work. So throughout those 10 years, we've been hearing stories. I mean, lots of stories. People would call and want to come to our office to tell us stories and share videos of what was happening with their clients when they use the SSP. Steve and Randall and I would have weekly meetings to just discuss, like the progress and what phase we were in and what we were doing to help, market the SSP, train for the SSP, all the aspects. But we started every meeting with a story. And those stories taught us a lot. They impacted us emotionally. They spurred us on. And so the idea of a book about the stories of SSP sort of was hanging around, and we sort of periodically would mention this idea. And anyway, now here is that book. But before I get to anything related to the book, I want to talk about what is the SSP, which was this tool that was literally hiding in plain sight for, I don't know, how long would you say, Steve? Almost a
Well,
decade itself.
it was more than a decade. So I had developed it in the late 1990s. So
Yeah. So it's a tool that can really help to alleviate dysregulation. Let's just start there. It was developed by Steve. He had in mind that that this could be a tool to work with children on the spectrum, where the tool could help address their state rather than their behavior in that stimulus object response paradigm. And it's now an evidence-based, non-invasive therapy that involves listening with a attuned, co-regulating therapist to music that has been filtered specifically to focus on the frequency envelope of the human voice. This is so important because we get our cues of safety and our sense of okayness in the world from people, from connection with people, and their voices are so important to us.
Yeah.
Everything affects our voice, and the auditory input of those frequencies gives cues to the autonomic nervous system to accept safety and to downregulate defensiveness.
Yeah.
It's a bottom-up therapy, and because of that, it doesn't require any belief system, motivation, or effort on the client's part. They can passively experience the SSP, and these sounds come in and just directly impact the nervous system. So it's been a useful therapy in so many ways, but one way in particular that sort of like people tell the strongest stories about is that they didn't have to tell their story. It wasn't about their story. It was about their state. And that's what's nice about this tool, is that it shifts the focus from story to state. So it's an effective tool. It's not meant to be a standalone tool. It pairs very well and can help accelerate progress in other modalities. And that's what we're here to talk about. That's what we talk about in the book.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. So first of all, Karen said that this technology is paired with an attuned therapist. And I'm wondering if you can share why it's so important to have an attuned therapist. I know Karen talked a little bit about it, but I know you've been doing clinical work with that tool. So why is that important?
My experience has been that the therapist is there to create, and I think that it's a journey towards creating, which depends on each unique person, their history, their experiences with connection, but a container for safety to be able to take in, to be able to notice what's happening inside and outside as it emerges. I think the therapist is there as a support, as a guide, making collaborative decisions around how much or how little, and what's going to be the context or the conditions that are around the person to facilitate listening, and where are we going to start, because we actually have multiple options when it comes to the SSP in terms of playlists, in terms of different type. The SSP comes in the SSP Connect, the SSP Core, and the SSP Balance. And so the clinician is the companion. And again, it's not to say that we can't listen to the SSP independently, but I think that there's a real importance that it becomes paired, and the clinician is then making collaborative decisions with the client to determine, not just how much or how little in terms of timing, but how much or how little is going to be done in togetherness. And will there be experiments around independent listening? And if that's the case, what's going to be around them? And I think that the clinician also models, mirrors, and is part of the repatterning process.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to get to more polyvagal meets SSP, like what is actually happening. So if someone is using SSP, what do they actually experience, and how is that related to the polyvagal theory?
Well, let me kind of step in because we have to put a little bit more information out there. We have to say, uh, how does a mother calm her baby? How do you talk to your pets? And I'm not saying how do you talk to your children or your spouse. I'm saying how does an effective mother calm her baby?
Yeah.
And or how does an effective pet owner, and I got to be careful about using the word owner, partner maybe, uh, enables, and that's what you're doing, enabling the pet to feel safe enough to welcome your approach. And that is really what the actual underlying mechanisms. So through our own evolutionary journey, our voice became linked with our vagal regulation of the heart. So what we were doing was broadcasting our physiological state. And when we use an intonation in our voice, the surrogate metaphor is heart rate variability. We are having more heart rate variability, we're more resourced, and we're projecting that at another person. And that enables that other person, through their listening capacity, to downregulate uh, their defenses. And it's listening, it's not hearing. And listening now is involving neuroregulation of muscles in your middle ear. And those muscles, when you are frightened, basically are portals, they enablers of low frequency predator sounds. So when you're scared and you hear low frequency sounds, if you're home alone, the house talks to you. If you're walking down a street in a strange town with a friend and the friend is talking to you, you don't hear what that person's saying. You hear the footsteps behind you because, in a sense, our listening capacity is an autonomic reaction. And so you don't yell at people if they're not processing information. You don't demand more of them. You try to regulate their state. So we did in our own studies, we actually measured the prosodic, the intonation of a maternal voice, and the effectiveness of the mother's voice on the babies. It's the 9-month-old heart rate and distress behaviors. And if the voice was prosodic, melodic, heart rate dropped over 10 beats per minute, and distress behaviors just whoosh. If the mother still engaged using, in a sense, same words or similar words, no effect on the autonomic state, no effect on behavior. So you could see in an experiment the effectiveness of these intonations. Now, polyvagal theory tells you why these frequencies work, tells you that it's part of our evolutionary heritage. It's how we signal co-regulation in others. And it starts off with maternal-child interactions, and then it goes into relationships and development of trust in others. So we talk about the voice carrying accessibility. And that is really what the therapist wants to provide to the client. And so I always had this kind of dream of stealth interventions, things that you could do that would enable the individual to be welcoming to intervention, not the intervention of treatment, but to allow the treatment to be effective. And that's really what this has all been about. And I call this the passive pathway, that we want to enable the neurophysiology of the client, of the child, of the spouse, of the pet to be welcoming to our engagement. And that's very polyvagal because what do we mean by engagement? We mean looking at the person, smiling, gesturing, and using intonation in our voice. So Safe and Sound Protocol is all about the social engagement system and signaling, and that's the magic take-home word, signaling the other's nervous system that it's safe enough to be accessible.
So you mentioned HRV or heart rate variability, and I'm wondering if you can, in simple terms, explain to those who watch and are not familiar with the term, what is HRV and what have you seen in the research? Because I know that was a lot of your early research, right?
Yeah,
With
well,
HRV.
my research was in the 60s. I actually was the first to quantify heart rate variability. So the issue was at that point, the neurophysiology was not really even asked. It was an observable. And I hate to say that people who talk about heart rate variability are still treating it like an observable, not as a neural index. To get the neural index, you have to process the heart rate variability and pull out certain components, like the respiratory component, which is purely vagal through the ventral vagus. So the point is that the rhythmicity, and we put that word in, rhythmicity is a signal that our autonomic nervous system is supporting homeostatic functions. All forms of challenges, stressors, or whatever term we want to use, even anxiety, suppresses those endogenous rhythms. And now we can even use other metaphors that are not very scientific, and that is visualize being rocked or floating in the ocean on a rubber raft without the fear of falling off. And the answer is, do you just close your eyes and people just start to smile because they know what those rhythms mean to their body. And really, it's a sad world because even though we know what our body wants, we really are no longer in contact with that, in a sense, replenishing those needs. And the irony is that we are this really amazing organism. We can suppress those rhythms. And we do that with mental effort, we do that with exercise, and that's fine. But we need some time for these rhythms to come back.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one word that nobody has mentioned yet is neuroception, which I think is one of the most important concepts of the polyvagal theory and how we apply it in therapy. So I'm wondering, Jill, if you can talk about neuroception and what it is and why do we need to know that as therapists?
Great question. And also, Steve and Karen, please jump in here. So my understanding of neuroception is our brain's incredible ability to, beneath consciousness, quite quickly, be able to attune to cues of danger quick, so that we are able to react. And so we are walking through the world. And for me, it almost feels like this underlying incredible radar that we have that allows us to navigate the world and then respond through these incredible systems that we have built into us. That's my understanding.
Yeah.
Yeah. Neuroception is such a huge topic, and it's such a big component of polyvagal theory. And I think it speaks to the forgiving aspect of polyvagal theory. I always say that polyvagal theory is very forgiving and hopeful. And the forgiving part is that it shifts the narrative from judging to understanding, because we're focused on how has someone's nervous system reacted to their environment. It honors state shifts. It says that our behavior is not our character, and that our bodies are constantly responding to our sense of our neuroception of our environment. So I love that about it. I'll just also say why I think it's so hopeful. And that is that the nervous system can change and that small cues of safety can always accumulate. And those can be from connections with other people. They can be from, music. They can be from therapies, including EMDR and SSP. And we can repattern our nervous system. Our current state will always bias our neuroception. So if we're in a defensive state, we may be more likely to mistake a cue of safety for one of danger because we're on higher alert. So that's an important thing, that state and neuroception are so inextricably linked.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
Karen, that last point, we can say that that's why when someone's in a state of fear, engagement by another with good intention may not be received as good intention. But there's one point we kind of like glossed over, and that is virtually all living systems have a neuroception of danger or threat, including single cells. The issue is what mammals have is that they have a neuroception of signals of safety. And that the example of that is the intonation of voice of the mother calming the baby. That's reflexive. And in fact, when people within the trauma community start to use the safe and sound, we learned even more. We learned that even those with complex trauma, their initial reaction to the safe and sound was openness, but that was vulnerability. Once they had the interoception of that feeling, they said, I'm getting out of here. Because it wasn't that SSP wasn't working. It was that it didn't fit their narrative. Their narrative was that if I feel this vulnerability, I better get out of this situation. And so when the therapists start to understand that, they realized they could use SSP as a neural exercise of literally allowing their patients, their clients, to experience this accessibility, which starts off as vulnerability, but only for short periods of time. To me, that was the greatest learning experience for me. And it was literally jolting because I felt SSP was, in a sense, the code of signaling safety that people could not refuse. Now, that part was true, but I didn't initially understand why experiencing that they would want to refuse it. And then I had to understand the history of complex trauma and the adaptive functions we have. So even though we have these feelings, those feelings become associated with being injured.
I just want to make sure that I understand. So are you saying that for some people or some of our clients, cues of safety may not be perceived as safe?
We don't use the word perceived. Remember, this is all neuroception. Because if we
Okay.
use the word perception, we start bringing in cognitive intention. And we think that we can teach people to correct their perceptions with information. This
Yeah.
is the information is their interoception, their bodily feeling, and that then will trigger different top-down feelings of acceptance. So the issue is their neuroception works. And what it does is it shifts physiological state and it shifts it to a calmer state. But the feedback, the interoception, the afferent feedback from the gut to the brain is now associated with vulnerability. So there's like, I have a neuroception, I'm like this, then I have an interoception and I'm out the room. And actually, Jill, you can probably talk about that because I'm sure
Yeah.
you've seen cases like that.
Yeah, Jill and I talked about headphones flying over your office at some point.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And Rotem, you said you had mentioned something about, some of the clients that we work with and us too, as clinicians and therapists, our own vulnerabilities, what's happening for us in terms of neuroception and what's going on within the therapeutic dyad and in that dance. And I think there's an interplay that happens between the two.
Yeah. I'm wondering if you can share more, Jill, about your own experiences seeing people who are maybe not ready to be in that state of safety.
With the SSP?
With the SSP, and then what do you do? How do you help your clients? How do you help with whether if it's, attunement or certain, phase 2 interventions, whatever it is that you do that help clients regulate?
A great question. So I'm going to start by saying I think this idea of readiness for the SSP, I think that there may be a bit of a misconception here. Perhaps we're talking about, for example, the core SSP, the main program. I actually think anyone and everyone can be ready for the SSP. It becomes about how we deliver it. And it may be that we start with delivery that's not, for example, not on headphones, but it's somewhere else in the room, allowing someone distance from it. Maybe we start with the SSP Connect that doesn't have the modulation in it, just to orient to the music. And maybe it's for 30 seconds and then we pause. And so I actually think that we can all incorporate the SSP, and it may be that we're building up readiness to get to the SSP core, but we actually can still work with it. And what's emerging in the room is clinical data. It's incredibly important, and it's data that's going to help us navigate where do I go next? And what can we be curious about together? And then it allows me to reflect back to my client what I'm observing while I'm simultaneously observing and attuning to what's happening in me, because that's also really, really important data. And so where I'm starting is, how do I understand my clients' experiences, their history, their own neuroception to cues of safety, to cues of danger? What about my voice? I mean, my voice can be incredibly triggering for a lot of people. And so sometimes I have to play with the intonation of my voice. And that, from the get-go, helps me to understand, okay, so what considerations may I need to think about, as if this is something the client is wanting to explore, for us to start to slowly go near. So this is about titration. We can all incorporate the SSP in practice. The question becomes, how are we going to titrate it? And when are we going to start that titration?
Yeah. And how do you do that? In general, the concept of titration is coming from more somatic therapies, I think. I wonder, Jill, if you can explain that and how we use it in the therapy room, whether if it's with SSP or not.
So I see it as a process of attuning to multiple different things at the same time. So I'm observing what's happening for my client. I'm becoming curious about what's happening for my client to see what level of self-report I'm able to get. I'm attuning to what's happening inside of me simultaneously. How am I reacting? What am I noticing? What belongs to me? What may not belong to me? Becoming curious then in this space with the client to see what they're noticing. And we're engaging in experiments to see what happens. And so how I'm titrating something depends on each client, and it depends on, again, the observations, the client's self-report, my own internal observations, as well as, of course, what I know and understand about the history. And I'm working to bring this together, and it's a moment-to-moment process where my own level of engagement and my own capacity and functioning comes into play as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Jill. Karen, we mentioned headphones. Jill mentioned 3 programs. I'm wondering if you can talk more about kind of like the mechanics of delivery of SSP. What does that look like? What is the SSP if someone were to use it, or EMDR therapist were to use it? What does that look like?
Thanks. I'd like to just reflect on Jill's response first, which was so beautiful. And I saw elements of what Deb Dana, who's an amazing translator of polyvagal theory and has lots of resources out there, lots of books. Kudos to Deb Dana. How she talks about the elements of safety for the nervous system are context, choice, and connection. And I heard all of those from you, Jill, as you were talking about your process in connecting and being with your client and learning and seeing and feeling about yourself and feeling about them and offering choice in another playlist pathway, for example. And just to say one more thing about titration is that we don't talk about titration specifically in the book. Like there's no rules or set of rules about titration. But in every case that's in the book, you can see that each therapist, each clinician has figured out their own way to titrate the SSP with that specific client, because each client is different, each day is different, each session is different, things happen in their life. And so titration is a very fluid thing that you're always sort of like very attuned to and kind of adjusting based on what's happening in the moment. So stepping back from the concept of titration, so SSP is delivered via an app that was created by Unite Health, which is an amazing upgrade to the system that we were using, which were tiny little MP3 players that came in sort of a lunchbox looking case. And but now you just on your phone can access the playlists, and that will be given to you by your therapist. They will they will open certain playlists for you to have access to, mostly because so much of the delivery happens virtually, so via Zoom or some sort of screen, and it's quite effective. I must say, this therapy via Zoom, and we all learned about it during COVID, but it turns out to be a very nice way to deliver SSP. Probably many other therapies as well. So together, the therapist and the client will choose what pathway. There are different levels of the clinical levels of the filtration of the music. And there's also a choice of which underlying playlist that client would like to listen to, or what would be suitable for them. And there are over 6 different playlists that range from children's music to music from the 70s and 80s to classical music to groove to rhythmic music. So that's just the container for the filtration of the music. And the listening part of an SSP session is just a component of the time that the client and the therapist spend together, because a lot of it is spent, like Jill was saying, sort of developing a sense of safety in the client and creating a connection with them so that they can experience the sound in the context of safety. So the therapy is the safe and sound protocol, and it just is it's a perfect name because the safe is important before the sound. So it could be safe before sound, just like safe and sound. And depending on the titration, this fluid thing, the component that involves the client listening, could take a small amount of the full session or a long amount of the full session. And then as far as how long the whole process of listening to the full 5 hours of music, which is available, is also variable. I would say on the two ends of the spectrum, children tend to receive it quite well, and they're typically, assuming that they live in a safe household, they have their parents there who are co-regulating with them, and they can integrate this quite easily, typically. While at the other end, the longer end of how long it takes to complete the 5 hours of the listening. And some people don't even complete the whole 5 hours. They feel like they've gotten a lot of healing from, just let's say 3 hours or something like that. And that's all individual decisions. But people with complex trauma or chronic illness tend to, take longer to complete the full 5 hours.
Great. Steve, Karen mentioned the word filtration. I have a strong feeling that's tied to some of the stuff you talked about earlier. So if you can help our, viewers and listeners understand what does it mean, a filtered?
Okay. So the filtration, there are multiple dimensions here. One is the frequency band, and Karen mentioned some of that. It's frequency band of social communication. It's really, think of it as AM radio or voice on a cell phone. There's frequency band that we use to communicate our language. But within that band, so all low frequencies are pulled out and all high frequencies are pulled out. But that's not where the magic comes in. The magic comes in the modulation of those frequency bands, the challenges to the nervous system. So as you squeeze those frequency bands, the sound becomes narrower, thinner and thinner, literally. And sometimes it feels like it's disappearing. And that triggers a neuroception, basically of loss. And then the sound comes back, and that triggers a feeling of really exuberance. So we start feeling like we're being hugged again. So it's kind of like this wonderful rolling bit, and that's a neural exercise. So it's all constructed as neural exercises of modulating the frequency bands and determining how wide the band can be. So the earlier hours are narrower bands, and then it becomes wider and wider until you can handle the full range of human voice or
Yeah.
human social communication. But I did want to respond to some of the wonderful things Jill mentioned. There are two things. One is predictability is extraordinarily important because our nervous system literally interprets predictability as safety. So where we talk about excitement and novelty, that's only for people who are resourced. The people who are not resourced, that's the end of the world. They want to know where everything is. The second thing is, as I listened to her, I realized, Jill, you are a polyvagal informed therapist because she was basically reading her own body's responses to her clients. So she was, it says, using her own neuroception to evaluate the signals and the validity of the signals of her client. It's just beautiful as she was watching her client. And so the client, she's looking at face, listening to voice. And this creates this dynamic play in which we are both a performer and an observer in this interaction. But the notion of being polyvagal informed is that we start to listen to what our body is telling us about our own states, and we observe the voices and the facial expressions and the muscle tone in our clients. And then we get this literally multi-dimensional view of what that client is. And we're not looking at the client as someone who has a history, because that history is two-dimensional. And what we were seeing are really the dynamics embodiment of that history.
Yeah, that was a beautiful way to add on what Jill said. And I
Mm.
know that SSP, I know Jill, you and other clinicians wrote the guidelines for the integration of SSP and EMDR, but it's been used, we're going to go back to that in a second, but it's been used with other forms of therapy and specifically with somatic therapies. Is that right, Karen or Steve?
Yes, as we were saying before, it can be an accelerant to other therapies. And I want to just use as an example that the Meadows, which is an addiction rehab facility, they're based in Arizona, but I think they have locations around the country. And they have a 1 month residential program that they have multiple modalities that they use in their program. And they've over the years have now moved SSP to the front. So it's the first therapy that people receive because it really creates this beautiful platform of safety to take in therapy, the other therapies that they use. So just feel like that's a really good example of SSP helping someone's nervous system become more available to other therapies and modalities.
Yeah.
The only comment you brought up, basically somatic experiencing, is really a close model of titration or pendulation, as Peter would call it. And the idea was really you need to experience, you need to feel before you can proceed much further. And that's really in a way that many of the SSP providers have literally, let's say, utilized a similar model. But SSP is also folded into a lot of somatic experiencing therapist's strategy because it fits nicely.
Yeah. And I just want to make a point here that, I'm talking about EMDR and, somatic therapy or parts work therapy as if they're completely separate things. But I think that the beauty is to know these modalities and how you can integrate them and they're not kind of separate. Today we're doing EMDR and next week we're doing somatic experiencing, and then the week after we're doing IFS. All these therapies have a beautiful way that they integrate with each other.
Well, the answer becomes really pragmatically simple, that you have difficulty delivering a therapy if your client is in a state of threat. And the word would not be threat. They would use defensive. Your clients are defensive. They're self-protective. But really what it's telling you in their behavior, in their voice, in their facial expression is that their autonomic state is not accessible for interaction or therapy. And
Yeah.
SSP goes directly at that.
Yeah. Great. Jill, can you share about the guidelines that you and others created to integrate the two modalities? What are kind of like key highlights from these guidelines?
Absolutely. And I would say they're more like recommendations and consideration as opposed to guidelines, even though they're titled guidelines. And I say that because each unique person is going to come in differently. And I want to be careful that we're not manualizing this and instead space for it to be flexible, for it to be creative, and for us to really attune to our clients in a polyvagal informed way. We may be changing some of the guidelines depending on each unique client. But the way we approached this was, as a team, we looked at, what we want to keep in mind as we're integrating SSP into EMDR therapy. And so we pulled this together across the 8 phases. And commonly people think about utilizing SSP as part of phase 2 preparation, starting to repattern the autonomic nervous system in preparation for this visit when we move into our memory processing phases. Again, within phase 2, keeping in mind these titration considerations. And we also spoke about the ways in which we may integrate the SSP as part of phase 7 closure, the way it may be used in between sessions as a way of regulating, depending on how someone's responding to it, how many times someone's listened to it, someone's experience with listening to it the first time versus listening to it the second time may be very different. How we may even open session, for example, depending on what our focus is in phase 8. So again, the SSP can be integrated into many of the phases. Again, when we're moving into phases 4, 5, and 6, we're reprocessing, we're looking for activation. We're likely not going to be integrating the SSP during the reprocessing. Unless it is, for example, there's been an adverse experience with the SSP, for example, then there may be a consideration there. But the SSP really can be integrated across the 3 phases, the 8 phases, and I'm thinking the 3 prongs. So it can be integrated across the 8 phases with considerations according to each client, their history, where they are, what they need.
Yeah. Thank you, Jill. Back to the book that Karen and Steve wrote. Actually, Karen, Steve, and Jill, also you wrote a chapter here, which we're going to get to soon. Karen, I'm wondering if you can share, you and Steve kind of shared background and, polyvagal theory and how it's all connected. And then different clinicians wrote some different chapters about their experiences. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about what stood out to you, like some cases that are unique that kind of can help those who view this webinar live or later to understand the potential in the Safe and Sound protocol.
Sure. So the cases in the book, there are 13 cases in the book, and it's about 2/3 of the book, these stories that we tell. And we went very in depth on the client's experience, and together with the client and their provider, pulled together their story, which many people said that itself was a very healing process to review that experience and that story. And I should say, we really are so grateful for everyone who participated in the book this way. It was very generous of spirit of them, and the book wouldn't be the same without them. So we just have to say thank you, and thank you to Jill for being both the client and the provider in your case. So the cases cover many symptoms that people were hoping to address in their case. And they range from, so we're going to use words that Steve would rather think about it all as defensiveness, but they pop up as terms like anxiety and depression, suicidality, the experience of bullying and feeling isolated or othered in their own experience. There was a case about perfectionism, There's a case about COVID and COVID nearly tipping into a long COVID case. There's a case about Parkinson's disease and many more. And we want to say that the cases, they're not all super success cases. Some of them, had some stumbles along the way, and that's important to show. I think that the process of reading these cases gives you such a variety of ways that different therapists from different modalities or different disciplines approach using the SSP, but how it can be, similarly effective in so many scenarios because of the underlying goal of SSP being to alleviate dysregulation and provide more access to cues of safety in their body. There were some themes that we saw kind of among all the cases. And first is that polyvagal theory on its own as psychoeducation is very healing itself. So people found a lot of relief, a lot of understanding about their experience from learning about polyvagal theory, and then learning even more deeply about the ways that their autonomic nervous system works, how they travel through various states is very meaningful and helpful, because that helps you to create more resilience in your own nervous system by learning about it. So that was something that sort of we noticed across all the cases. We noticed that this thing that we say in the book quite a lot, which is safety begets safety, that really there is a real possibility of an upward spiral to be developed by creating safety, and small steps really matter a lot. And another observation was that we hadn't really recognized that so much that there is a hybrid state that's not really been talked about so much before, which is this idea that you can get trapped in a cyclic defense loop. So in the first part of the book, we talk about states and the continuum of states, including hybrid states. And this cyclic defense loop, you'll all recognize it because you see it. And that is that someone can be in sympathetic and activated and hypervigilant and angry, or all the things, agitated, and can't get out of that state, but the body too can't sustain it forever. And so it's metabolically costly for the body to stay in a sympathetic state. So at some point, the state tips over into a more of a dorsal shutdown state, and all the feelings and sensations that go along with that. And again, the body can't stay in that state for very long. And so you end up sort of going in this cycle of defensiveness, where clients are sometimes taking both antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication, and it becomes really a trap that you can't exit from. And it really required in these cases, and it happened in almost all the cases where this was the autonomic tendency of the client, where abundant cues of safety and this work together with an attuned clinician really made a difference and helped them sort of escape from that cyclic defense loop.
Yeah, first of all, I appreciate the kind of sharing the bumps along the way, right? Like nothing works smoothly right away. And this is a tool, a very effective tool. And I want to ask you, Jill, so you're one of the contributors to the book. You wrote a chapter about symptoms of long COVID that you yourself experienced, that you shared with me a while ago. And as a result, I share it with other members of our EMDR learning community, and they started using it for themselves and also reported that they benefited. But I'm wondering if you can share a little bit, Jill, about, first of all, your experience, and then what did the Safe and Sound protocol offer you?
Absolutely. So this would have been in and around, I think, 2020. This was my third case of COVID, but by far the worst case of COVID that I had had. It was, my symptoms were quite aligned with what I had been hearing about, what I had been reading. I had lost my smell. I had lost my taste. Severe exhaustion, severe fatigue. There was coughing, it was a bad case of COVID. And I had gone through the initial acute period of COVID, where I would say for about 7 to 10 days, I can't remember exactly, but I was quite sick. And I had had a day of starting to feel better and starting to feel as though something was shifting inside of me. And I thought, okay, so I'm starting to move towards perhaps some healing, some recovery, some wellness. And I'll never forget, I had been walking to get a glass of water, and all of a sudden I stopped dead in my tracks because I had the experience that the floor underneath me was like liquid, as though I was becoming quite dizzy. My balance was quite off. It was in that moment, it was terrifying. So it was this physiological experience that I had, this neurological experience that I had, accompanied by a fear response that happened. And so I slowed myself down. I stopped and thought, okay, so maybe I'm not healing as well as I thought I was. And over the course of the next few days, my symptom presentation started to shift. I now started to have some symptoms of long COVID, particularly around dizzy and loss of balance. I was starting to feel as though I couldn't clear anything out of my chest any longer. I was having significant problems with reading. So being able to follow a text and hold the information, and it was a different experience for me than I was used to. I was having problems with word recall and being able to pull words that had regularly been part of my day-to-day life out and be able to articulate them. I was having a shift in terms of gastrointestinal issues, and simultaneous to this, so this is all happening in my body, and I'm getting extremely scared. I am becoming, my sympathetic nervous system is getting activated, and I'm tuning towards this danger of, what does this mean for my health? What does this mean for my wellness? What does this mean for work? And as Dr. Porges referenced earlier, I got to this place of realizing my health, my growth, and my restoration is severely compromised. And part of that was I was now attuning to cues of danger inside me and outside of me, and I found myself trapped in what Karen called the cyclic defense loop.
Were you able to see clients at that time? Were you working?
No.
No.
And that, I'm also panicking simultaneously of, I've already been off for 10 days. And not only what's happening to me now, but I'm also now projecting into the future. And what does this mean? And am I going to be able to manage this and control this and get a hold of this? And reading about what people were struggling and suffering with. So I was trapped in this defense loop.
Yeah. Okay. And then what did you do, and how did that change things for you?
So I do want to share that simultaneous to this, we talk about SSP as being a beautiful adjunct to other therapies. I do think it's really important to share that I was in my own therapy simultaneously. I have my own early experiences of developmental trauma. And so, I have a compromised neuroception, or I tend to attune to cues of danger more readily than cues of safety. And so I was already engaged in my own work in different modalities, specifically deep brain reorienting and EMDR, going back and forth. And so that was going on the side. So my use of SSP truly was incorporated as part of this overarching, therapeutic process that I was engaged in. And so I started to do some research, not knowing what was going on. And I discovered some research related to vagus nerve inflammation as a byproduct of COVID. And I thought to myself, a lot of it was around the use of vagus nerve stimulators. And I thought, why would I get a vagus nerve stimulator? And no criticism to that. When I have access to the SSP, which is a neural exercise that goes much deeper than that. So I thought, what I'm experiencing right now, I started to sit with it and think what's going on in my mind and body feels very autonomic nervous system related. Let's see what happens if I incorporate the SSP. And so I created a very specific structure for myself that was predictable, dependable, and created cues of safety around me as I was listening. And each day I was listening, I started to notice changes. And again, there's no research behind this, so I want to put that out there, that this was based, it's anecdotal evidence and my own experience, that I started to
others experience and others
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah, that I'm starting to notice these shifts and changes, whereby all of a sudden it felt as though I was now moving towards health, growth, and restoration. And I said, on day 3, there was something very profound that happened for me. From the bottom of my feet to my head, it was as though I felt this sensation that moved right through me, that felt as though it brought me back to balance and homeostasis. It was very profound. Now, this was my 3rd round of listening to the SSP, so it wasn't the first time I had listened to it. So holding that in mind too. But my long COVID symptoms disappeared.
Yeah, that's amazing. Steve, any thoughts about that? What just Jill?
Yeah, I do. So, we have a pen on the SSP, or at least on the technology. And one of the claims that was approved by the patent office was that of an acoustic vagal nerve stimulator. So, so there's a sufficient documentation, because I had done research showing that it changed autonomic state this was the autistic adolescents, that it did shift that. What I want to really kind of emphasize regarding Jill's narrative is that long COVID is not that much different than other chronic disorders. It sits in this space where if you go to a physician, they can't find anything wrong with you. So it's like chronic pain, chronic functional neurological disorders. In a sense, there's no pathophysiology. And I want to, in a sense, give you a little narrative on this. So certain areas of medicine, such as gastroenterology, about 50% or more of the patients in those clinics have no pathophysiology. And so what that means is that the symptoms are there, but the underlying physiology that medicine uses to validate a disorder aren't there. And many people are really abused by the medical system because they're being told this is in their head. Well, it's in their nervous system. So I need to now give you a little history here about the whole disease model. Basically, disease models are based on a subdiscipline called nosology. And this goes back hundreds of years, where there was basically collecting symptoms, observables. And those observables would cluster, and then there'd be an underlying pathophysiology. But what happens when that pathophysiology doesn't line up with the observables? Now, what medicine has done is gone steps further. It says not only is there underlying pathophysiology, but there's most likely a genetic causality. So it makes these inferential jumps that make us feel that we're determined to have these disorders. And since Jill did share her own trauma history, I feel that I can not talk about you specifically, but I can talk about the linkage between trauma history and getting COVID. So we did a study early in the COVID pandemic, spring of 2020. And we had 2,000 people in this survey study. We measured basically adversity history and autonomic regulation, and then mental health symptoms, and did they get COVID. So of the 2,000, 100 got COVID. However, that 100, none of that 100 had people with low adversity histories. They all had high adversity histories. And it was actually like linear. So even only 100 out of 2,000, we could detect virtually all of them by looking at autonomic reactivity or looking at their adversity history. So there was a linkage between autonomic reactivity, adversity history, and getting COVID. And this is this important thing that Jill fortunately could read her autonomic state and therefore develop a strategy. So the point that we were all, since we lived through the pandemic, is that we were not informed that trauma history was a pre-existing condition. And if that were treated or understood, it becomes in polyvagal theory this intervening variable, because trauma history is often related to autonomic dysregulation. So in fact, if you want to build the models, it's trauma history through autonomic dysregulation leads to these events. And trauma history is related to outcome, but the predictability becomes 3 times better if you look at autonomic reactivity. So the other part of this whole story, Jill, is that our bodies, whether it's mental health or physical health, when the body is under threat, common things occur. One is that ventral vagal withdrawal. The second is inflammation. You start seeing these general clusters that become a disease entity. And all they're really saying, all they're telling you is my body's under life threat. And now how can I do that? You go to a physician, they say, take this antibiotic, take this medicine, do these things. And reality is you need to signal the nervous system that it's literally okay to come out and play again. That's really what you're doing. And the whole notion of neuromodulation is signaling the nervous system that it can do its job. It doesn't have to go back into defense mode. And what we see in disease and chronic disease is just like we see in mental health issues. The nervous system reacted to save your life, but got stuck there. Now we have to, in a sense, praise it and get it back out. It's okay to come out and play again. So thank you for sharing that, Jill.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. And yeah, there is a lot of research on early childhood trauma and development of inflammation, body, and that's might be
and then you flip it, and the issue is there's a lot of research on vagal nerve stimulation and reduction of inflammation. So, but vagal nerve stimulation, you got to understand what it really means. You're actually stimulating the sensory pathways through the brain.
uh-huh.
And then the brain goes back through these pathways and reduces inflammation. So safe and sound and the acoustic intervention is a signaling to the brain to trigger the vagal regulation on. So it is going to be effective.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks for everyone who joined us live. Thank you, Jill, Karen, and Steve for your time and knowledge. Yeah, that was great. Great information. We got a lot of good responses in the chat. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.